Welcome to the debate. Our discussion today centers on, I think it's fair to say, one of the most influential and really hotly contested ideas in moral philosophy, utilitarianism. I mean, at its core, it's this ethical theory defined by its commitment to consequentialism, right? The idea that the morally right action is just the one that produces the best overall outcome, specifically by maximizing general happiness.
Exactly. Maximizing overall well-being. This focus on results or, the greatest good for the greatest number it has some pretty deep roots. It really got started with Jeremy Bentham, who tried to make ethics a rigorous science through hedonism, defining the good simply as pleasure in the absence of pain. And he created that famous hedonic calculus to try and quantify utility.
A really profound refinement. He shifted away from Bentham's purely quantitative measure by introducing the concept of qualitative differences in pleasure. He really emphasized the value of our, quote, higher faculties, intellectual, moral pursuits over just physical gratification.
But that evolution, it didn't solve what I see as the most fundamental structural problem within the theory. So the central question we're facing today is really this: where exactly does the moral obligation attach? Does it apply directly to maximizing utility with each individual action we take, or does it primarily apply to the utility that we get from following general moral rules that, over time have proven to maximize overall happiness?
And I'll be arguing that for utilitarianism to be a practical, stable, and genuinely humane ethical system, the creation and faithful adherence to secondary moral rules, what we call the rule utilitarian approach, is absolutely necessary.
And I'm going to maintain that any deviation from the direct calculation of consequences for every single situation, the Act Utilitarian commitment, is frankly a failure of consequentialism itself. The purity of the principle demands we maximize utility right here, right now.
Okay, so if we look at the pure act approach, the first issue we really run into is just its overwhelming impracticality. We face what philosophers often call the impossibility and impracticality objection. I mean, how can any individual, in real time calculate all the long-term cascading effects of a single action across all individuals involved, potentially for generations? It's a calculation task that just exceeds human cognitive capacity. And this is precisely why we must rely on moral rules. Rules like do not steal, do not lie, or respect fundamental rights. These are not some kind of arbitrary duties. They're generalizations that are derived from, the vast accumulation of human history, showing which actions reliably tend toward maximizing long-term happiness. Mill himself recognized this. He famously compared these rules to a nautical almanac for moral life. They give us the necessary shortcuts, and crucially, they establish the social stability and predictability that are just essential for human flourishing. When we protect fundamental rights, we're not appealing to some external duty. We're recognizing that the foundation of security and trust prevents a massive systemic decline in happiness that would be caused by societal fear and paranoia. Justice, from this perspective, is simply the set of rights that, when protected, yields the greatest overall long-run good.
And that's a powerful point on practicality, I'll grant you that. But let's look at the systemic costs of that very approach. If we are truly committed to consequentialism, to the idea that results matter above all else, then the morally right action must always be the one that produces the maximum utility among all the available alternatives in that specific context. So to appeal to a rigid rule and breaking that rule when breaking it would clearly produce a better outcome is, by definition, an abandonment of the core utilitarian commitment. Rules become just rules of thumb, guidelines that are useful because they usually work, sure, but which we have to be willing to discard the moment they mandate a suboptimal or even a disastrous result. If your system requires you to follow a rule even when it actively reduces aggregate well-being, that system it's no longer utilitarian. I mean, take the classic example, Jim's dilemma. Jim is confronted with a situation where he must shoot one innocent person to prevent the execution of 19 others. Act utilitarianism gives a clear, if tragic, answer. He must save the most lives. A rule utilitarian appealing to the rule against killing might be paralyzed,
and by refusing to act allows 19 unnecessary deaths. The outcome demands the action. The end justifies the means strictly on the basis of maximizing the aggregate good. I agree that security is vital, but what happens when that pure utility calculation leads to a truly terrifying outcome? If following a rigid rule, never lie, never break a promise, if that results in mass suffering, then the rule system has failed. The purity of the greatest happiness principle, it seems to me, demands flexibility. Bentham, even when he was discussing law, he differentiated between evils of the first and second order. The evil of the first order is the immediate harm, the one person who gets killed. The evil of the second order is the alarm and danger caused by breaking the rule, the fear that Jim might just shoot anyone. And while we have to factor in that second order fear, it shouldn't override a massive certain first order good. The integrity of consequentialism requires us to look at the consequences of the particular action, not just some generalized hypothetical of what happens if everyone broke that rule.
But that line of reasoning, that prioritizing of first-order gain over second-order stability, it completely ignores the catastrophic systemic utility losses that happen when core moral rules are abandoned, especially rules about justice. Let's go back to that classic critique you brought up, the sheriff scenario. A town is on the verge of a riot, and the sheriff determines that framing and executing one innocent, friendless man will instantly stop the violence, saving dozens of lives and preventing widespread property damage. Act Utilitarianism appears committed to punishing the innocent man because the aggregated consequences prevent greater suffering. My position, following Mill, is that respecting the rights of the innocent provides a foundation of security that is, and I'm quoting him here, more basic for human happiness than any short-term gain you get by sacrificing him.
If the public fears that their government or the legal system will just frame an innocent person whenever it's convenient, that fear fundamentally destroys trust and civil security, and that is a loss of utility that far, far outweighs the utility of stopping a single riot. So rule utilitarianism, when you apply it properly, asks, what principles of justice maximize overall utility in the very long run? And the answer is always principles that guarantee basic rights.
The core philosophical objection to that approach is that act utilitarianism just forces us to face the fact that the theory fails to take the distinction between persons seriously. It treats the pains and pleasures of distinct individuals as if they all belong to a kind of mass person, an aggregate sum. Whether you apply the calculation directly with act or indirectly through a rule with rule, the logic is still aggregative. The suffering of one can always be justified by the gain of the many. Rule utilitarianism it tries to mask the structural flaw by setting the aggregation calculation further back in time.
And to counter that aggregative logic, we have to return to Mill's great refinement, the qualitative distinction in pleasures. My reliance on rules is fundamentally justified because it protects the activities of our higher faculties. Mill famously argued, it is better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. Certain pleasures, derived from deliberation, from dignity, from self-determination, are, according to competent judges, inherently preferred, and you can't resign them for any quantity of lower, more animalistic pleasures. These higher capacities, our ability to reason, to debate, to live freely, they are essential to true human happiness, and they can only be realized through protected liberties, which is the whole subject of Mill's On Liberty. This more sophisticated definition of happiness, it both demands and justifies the creation of stringent rules that protect those liberties, even if, in one isolated case, violating them might provide immediate relief to a suffering majority.
That's a compelling argument. But have you considered that this qualitative distinction really risks abandoning true hedonism? Critics charged Mill with deserting his hedonism because he seems to be introducing non-hedonistic values, like the intrinsic value of dignity or reason, that aren't simply reducible to pleasure. If happiness isn't strictly defined by pleasure and the absence of pain, we lose the objective, quantifiable, reason-based measuring tool that Bentham gave us. I would insist on Bentham's rigorous quantitative approach, intensity, duration, all 7 of his metrics, as the only way to remain true to the original idea of maximizing well-being objectively. Mill's attempt to introduce a qualitative scale, well, it raises the issue that he's smuggling in values that are alien to utilitarianism. And if we stick to the pure aggregate calculation, we have to accept its most challenging implications.
Negative logic prioritizes the total sum over any kind of fair distribution. If a creature existed whose happiness registered astronomically high, pure act utilitarianism would demand we feed all our resources to that one monster, even if it starves billions of others, just because it maximizes the aggregate score.
The utility monster is a necessary challenge, I'll grant you. It forces us to consider distribution. But when we look at modern applications, we see exactly why the rule framework, which is focused on long-term systemic optimization, is so valuable in solving real-world distribution problems. And it's precisely because it focuses on institutions rather than just individual choices. I mean, consider the modern movement of effective altruism, or EA. This movement, rooted in consequentialist ethics, isn't about calculating every single decision for every person. It's about creating rules of giving and action based on maximizing impact. EA prioritizes causes based on their scale, their neglectedness, and their tractability. And this focus on long-termism, the recognition that future generations represent this astronomical potential loss of value if we fail to mitigate existential risks now, that is the ultimate rule utilitarian analysis.
It's a systemic approach to maximizing utility across all time, which transcends the immediate, localized concerns of the act perspective.
But whether you apply it by rule or by act, utilitarianism faces this inescapable problem that's known as the demandingness objection. It requires every single person to act at all times as a strictly impartial, disinterested, and benevolent spectator. If utility must always be maximized, then every citizen in an affluent country is morally obligated to make significant, life-altering personal sacrifices. The money you spend on a modest dinner out could buy hundreds of mosquito nets, saving lives in a low-income country, all because of the diminishing marginal utility of wealth. This obligation is total. It leaves no room for morally permissible actions that don't bring about the absolute best possible outcome. It's a system that demands a morality only for saints, making it, for most people, psychologically impossible to follow, which in itself probably reduces overall societal utility by promoting guilt and failure.
That's a valid concern about the personal burden, but I think the demandingness objection is sometimes overstated, especially in the rule utilitarian context. Empirical studies, even the ones cited by effective altruism proponents, suggest that the sacrifice required is often less painful than we imagine. A small, carefully calculated reduction in income contributes massively to global utility while correlating with only a minor drop in personal life satisfaction. And what's more, research even shows that spending money on others can actively improve one's own subjective well-being. And more importantly, the impartial, consequence-focused methodology proves most valuable precisely when it's applied to large-scale public policy, which is inherently a rule utilitarian project. We see this in the use of quality-adjusted life years, or QLAs, in healthcare resource allocation. This is a cold, impartial metric, sure, but it helps governments decide how to spend limited public health budgets to generate the most overall life years and health benefit, ignoring backward-looking considerations like deservingness or age, purely maximizing aggregated health utility.
Two Yellies are a clear example of the power of the aggregate approach, but they also bring us right back to the inherent tension. In prioritizing the greatest number of years, QA-ILAs often devalue treatments for individuals with complex chronic conditions because the cost-benefit analysis favors maximizing population health. The institutional rule, while it's impartial, still ignores the unique value of the individual person.
But that institutional approach, the application of the rule framework, is also how we tackle the kind of long-term ethical problems that no individual act calculation could ever solve. Utilitarianism supports creating institutional rules and systems like futures assemblies. These are legislative bodies explicitly mandated to represent the voiceless interests of future generations. This is a political and ethical mechanism designed to address the sheer scale and neglectedness of future utility, ensuring long-term utility maximization which is something the ACT approach really struggles to conceptualize beyond just immediate actions.
So, in summary, the intellectual strength of utilitarianism really lies in its rigorous, its uncompromising commitment to measuring consequences and demanding the absolute best possible outcome. Every attempt to introduce rigid secondary rules or to appeal to non-hedonistic qualitative distinctions ultimately weakens the theory's single defining feature, maximizing aggregated well-being. The tension between individual happiness and the aggregate good, the separateness of persons' objection, it's not something rule utilitarianism can escape. It's a conflict inherent to ethical consequentialism that has to be faced directly, even when it demands harm for the greater good.
I disagree fundamentally that ACT utilitarianism is the only pure form. I think utilitarianism is only viable as a practical, ethical, and political guide if it incorporates a sophisticated understanding of human flourishing, which requires Mill's qualitative distinction, and uses secondary rules to structure society and government. These rules aren't arbitrary deontological duties. They are sophisticated empirical conclusions derived from a comprehensive, long-term calculation of utility, ensuring the security, justice, and social stability that's necessary for higher forms of happiness to flourish. Respecting rights is, in the end, an empirical utility-maximizing rule.
Ultimately, this division between act and rule demonstrates that utilitarianism isn't one fixed monolithic theory, but a constant negotiation. It's a dynamic system that's still being evaluated on how best to achieve its ultimate goal, universal happiness, even if we radically disagree on the method of calculation.
Indeed. Whether we prioritize the immediate calculation of the act or the long-term utility of the rule, the crucial challenge remains exactly the same. How do we accurately quantify, aggregate, and prioritize well-being across individuals and across time? There is still so much to explore in the material, and the debate continues.